Good evening, participants and viewers who are watching us. This is Somava Basu, President and Founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, CGC, and I welcome you all to our today's session. Our today's session focuses on a new book by Professor J. Winter entitled The Day the Great War Ended, 24 July 1923, The Civilization of War, published by the Oxford University Press. This evening, we have with us our featured speaker, Professor J. Winter, and the panel consists of distinguished discussants, Professors Laura Robson, David Rodogno, and Robert Jerworth. We welcome you all to today's panel. Before we begin our today's book discussion, I would like to introduce our author and today's featured speaker, Professor J. Winter. J. Winter is the Charles J. Stile Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University and a noted historian and a specialist of world wars, genocide studies, and European history. He is considered as an influential scholar whose research in the study of First World War and his place in 20th century European history and culture hold significant and authoritative values in academia. His other research interests include remembrance of war in the 20th century, such as memorial and mourning sites, European population decline, the causes and institutions of war, British popular culture in the era of the First World War, and the Armenian genocide of 1915. He is the author and co-author of several books, including Socialism and the Challenge of War, Ideas and Politics in Britain, 1912 to 18, The Fear of Population Decline, written with Michael S. Teitelbaum, The Great War and the British People, The Experience of World War I, War Beyond Words, Languages of Remembrance from the Great War to the Present, and most recently, his new book, The Day the Great War Ended, 24 July 1923, The Civilization of War. Professor Winter is trained at Columbia and Cambridge and has been associated with several institutions, including Hebrew University of Jerusalem, University of Warwick, and Carnegie Council. In 2022, he accepted our generous proposal to be part of our association, and within CGC, he serves as an advisory chair to the Vertex of the Genocide, Holocaust, and Disaster Studies. Today, we are extremely joyful to present to you Professor J. Winter, who would be discussing his new book along with the other panelists. But before that, I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Winter for his opening remarks and to present a brief overview of his new book. Over to you, Professor.
Well, thank you indeed, and thank you very much for organizing this virtual meeting. What I wanted to say is that my book has a number of different purposes, one of which is to say that we really know relatively very little about what war is. Many people have found that war has shaped or disfigured their lives, but the nature of the institution that does it is highly unstable. It changes. And over the course of the 20th century, it's changed in ways that I think are evident in today's headlines. What I believe has happened in the course of the 20th century is that war has shifted from being a contest between armies controlled by governments into an array of violent events that happen by and large between those with arms and ordinary civilians. What is happening as I'm speaking today, and what's happening in Ukraine, I believe, is the logical outcome of a number of developments in the earlier 20th century to which Vladimir Putin has returned. So this story is one, I think, with a taste as of ashes attached to it, the ashes of the innocent in Ukraine. So let me start first by saying, what is the subtitle? The title of the book is the day the Great War ended. And that has a kind of, I think, flourish in the tail of it, because most people believe that the Great War ended in 1918 on the 11th of November. In most parts of the world, that is taken for granted. But like most things about war, what is taken for granted is not necessarily what happened. And one way of looking at the story of the Great War is that it was the tale of the actions of political and military leaders who simply lost control of the violence that they let loose on the world. The story of war is the story of the limited mastery of violence that individual statesmen had, an awful lot less than they thought they had. So the subtitle, The Civilianization of War, is one of the ways in which war escaped from the control of the political leaders. Most political leaders in 1914 who went to war did so as heads of government and with the authority of a legitimate state. But by 1918, after the Armistice of the 11th of November that led to ceasefires in the west of Europe, there was still a field of force contested over a vast array of territory in Eastern and Southern Europe, and indeed in many other parts of the world. And that array of violence not only was linked to the initial conflict starting in 1914, but was constructed anew because of something that happened in 1917, the Russian Revolution, that overthrew the czardom of centuries standing and created the first communist government that lasted for more than 100 days in Russia. And that government was at great difficulty to consolidate its power. Hence, civil war, war and revolution are a continuum, another example of where does war start and where does other kinds of violence, for example, revolutionary violence. And you could say the same thing. Where does war and counter-revolutionary violence begin? That's a very important story because the people engaging in it are frequently not in uniform. This is a story very well known to Robert Gervat in his scholarship and also in the country in which he teaches in Ireland, where a civil war carried on between 1916 and 1922, and then another one carried on for another year that followed it. So the idea is, when do wars end is actually a wide open question, and one that more and more historians have said we've got to try to deal with the cliches. 1918 is a nice, useful number. It just doesn't happen to be true. It happens to be convenient. And maybe what we should do is to let historians define things that we usually leave to diplomats and politicians. So if I had to define the First World War, it would be a series of wars that began in 1914, which had a preface, a prelude to it, 1912-13 in the Balkan Wars, and carried on until 1923, the time when everybody said, no more, we're tired, we're exhausted, we're finished, is 1923. That's when no great power had either the means or the energy or the finance, for that matter, to put an army in the field to challenge the nature of the peace. If you will, peace is when those who are belligerent are exhausted and too exhausted to fight. How about that as a definition of peace? I think it's one that we might want to maintain. Now, the definition of what I would call the rules of engagement in war is the reason I've given a subtitle that's different from the title of my book, because the rules of engagement in warfare in the 20th century change, and they change slowly but surely, and they change in different parts of the world. One reason why the organized violence of the kind that perhaps we might place in the Trojan War of the ancient period, or the Battle of Agincourt in the medieval period, or even the Napoleonic period, although there are exceptions there too, was a war between armies. Well, by the period of the First World War, mass violence had already escaped from that limitation. And the largest escape, or the most significant and the most brutal escape from that limitation that war is about armies, happened in the colonial war, where the suppression of uprisings and revolt took place under conditions that produced genocide, that also produced concentration camps, produced biopolitics in which the maintenance of imperial power entailed the suspension of the rule of law and violence that was effectively in the hands of ordinary people, whether they were in uniform or not. Perhaps one of the worst examples of this kind of escape of violence from control is in the Belgian Congo, which until 1908 wasn't even a colony. It was the private possession of the King of Belgium. So, if you will, the imperial character of 20th century war comes out of the imperial character of 20th century colonial violence. This is something that Hannah Arendt, a great political theorist, believed in, and wrote in a work in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is still important, I think, in informing our subject. So what happens in 1914-18 is a radical erasure of the boundary between civilian and military targets in war that had already been suspect in colonial wars. What kind of erasure happened between 14 and 18? One of the things that happened was the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide of 1915 was a direct outcome of a category many of us not play with, but use with care, called total war. Total war, by the way, is never total. It's totalizing. It's bringing in more and more of the resources and the capacity of societies to create weapons and armies to engage in violence. But it became a much more, as it were, a much more clear-cut exercise in biopolitics in 1915 in the Ottoman Empire. It had happened before. It's not the first genocide in history, but it's the first genocide where the great powers of the world, that control the world, and most of which were industrialized, could use assembly line killing to engage in their war aims. Now, one of the things that the Ottoman Empire, under the Committee of Union and Progress, wanted to do was to eliminate a national minority in its boundaries. The Armenian people had lived in Anatolia and in the Caucasus for 1,500 years. Their church, or churches, were institutions that had greater longevity than the Ottoman Empire itself. And yet, the notion that it was possible, thinkable, doable, to remove an entire people because of their suspect loyalty to the empire was put to the test in 1915 and carried on through 1916, and then at the end of the war and after it. So the Armenian genocide is one of the reasons why the term civilianization of war matters for an understanding of the 20th century. It set in motion forces that later we recognize elsewhere. And one of them, I think, by the way, is the horrible violence. Is it 1 million, perhaps, who died in the birth of modern India and Pakistan? The notion that civilians are the target of violence when wars either come to an end or peace is to be inflicted on populations is something that starts earlier, and I wanted to draw attention to how that happened at the end of the First World War. I think the important point to realize here is that the story of the peace treaty of Lausanne of 1923 is the story of the imperial world and its overreach. It's gone too far. Indeed, the War of 1914, I think, was the greatest imperial war to date. Probably, we can say that the Second World War was last great imperial war perhaps until the war in Ukraine. But nonetheless, what happened at the end of the First World War is an imperial victory for one side, Britain, France, Italy, Greece. But the cost of it was so high that these governments simply could not maintain the fruits of their own victory. The First World War was both the apogee and the beginning of the end of empire. It took decades, but it happened, and it happened palpably. That is to say, it was felt. And one place that it was felt was in Ottoman Turkey. One of the most interesting features, I think, of the peacemaking process in the East, in the Ottoman Empire, is that even after the supposed center of the world, Britain, France, Germany, had made peace, violence carried on in such a way that imperial power could not be stabilized. And one place where it happened was in Russia, where the Bolsheviks had the gall to seize the huge investments of British and French middle-class people, and some rich people too. 1 out of every 6 franc invested in the world by French people, most of whom are in Paris, where I'm speaking from. 1 out of 6 was invested in Russia, and they lost it when the Bolsheviks maintained their hold on power and won the Civil War. So 1923 is a moment when the imperial order had to be reorganized. But it had to be reorganized for another reason. The other reason was that even though the Allies had among them the government of Greece, that government was very unstable in 1918. And through a very severe dispute between people surrounding the king and people surrounding the prime minister, King Constantine, Prime Minister Venizelos, some of them believed in a dream. Others would call it a folly. You might call it a kind of dissociation from reality. And it was the rebirth of the Byzantine Empire, giving Greece a huge empire spanning 7 seas, according to the king, which would make Constantinople, city of Constantine, the Greek city it once was. Well, the Turks lost the war because they were on the German side, and the Greeks were on the side of the winners. But in the course of the peace negotiations, all kinds of things happened. Here's my view that war is not only about long, over-determined things, but over accidents. When the Italians were furious about not getting the eastern coast of, or the western coast of Yugoslavia, the eastern borders of the Adriatic Sea, they were thinking of possibly invading Turkey, and the Allied leadership, make sure they didn't do that, said that the Greeks could come and have their own empire on the Anatolian coast, with the city of Smyrna, which had suffered terribly in the course of the war, under Greek control, and latifundia, an area around it, to boot. Well, this was a catastrophic mistake, and it never should have happened. But once it happened, it did something which occurs, unfortunately, many times in history, which is that defeated powers can actually rise up and make their claim to power a movement that is supported by the majority of the population. And so this defeated country, Turkey, once it was invaded, not only by the Allies, who had their fleets in Constantinople, but also by the Greek army, once the Greek army, which was dominant, or put it this way, was overwhelmingly composed of people of the Greek Orthodox religion, came to Anatolia, where there were Greek Orthodox people who had lived there for 1,000 years, but there were also a majority of Muslims. The Muslim population of Turkey turned from being a vanquished country into being a rebel. And that rebellion was led by a man named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. In 1922, his forces destroyed the Greek invasion of Anatolia. Now, when that happened, when the military decision was made, time to have a peace conference. When the military issue was resolved, it was time for the Western countries to say, enough. We won. Well, now you won in another war. Let's call it quits. And they did so in a Swiss city, Lausanne, not very far from Geneva, between November 1922 and July 1923. And it lasted in two parts, this peace conference. The first went from the 21st of November until the 4th of February, when it collapsed. And the reason it collapsed was that the Turkish government, which was the only country with an army in the field that could actually maneuver, that was really an army, the British and the French didn't have an army in the field because their civilians wanted to go back home and do what civilians do, live a peaceful life. The Greek government had no army at all. There was an army in Russia. Nobody wanted it to move out of where it was. So the issue of how to make peace out of this Turkish victory became the subject of the peace conference. And the country that has the, as it were, majority, dominant military power is likely to be the country that can dictate the terms of the peace. Not entirely, but in essence, in important ways. And what my book is trying to show is how that peace reflected what the new rebel Turkish state wanted. And what they wanted was to remove the Greek Orthodox population from their country. They wanted to Turkify, and they wanted to create an entirely Turkish nation. To do that, they gave up a lot of the old Ottoman Empire in Palestine and Saudi Arabia, even in part in Egypt. They gave it all up and created a republic. And that republic, by the way, which has recently suffered a terrible natural disaster in its southeastern corner, has the boundaries of the peace treaty of 1923. Now, why did they say no on the 4th of February? They said no because they wanted to establish their sovereignty as against the imperial powers. And what better way to say that we Muslims, we men of color, we brown men, black people, we people who don't look like Europeans are not going to accept what the greatest imperial leader of them all, Lord George Nathaniel Curzon, is telling us to do, which is to sign on the dotted line. There were issues, economic and financial and legal issues, but fundamentally, the diplomacy here was a performance of sovereignty. It meant that the Turkish people were free. And as a result, what they did, and I think they probably couldn't have done it any other way, was to tell Lord Curzon, who gave them a deadline, I am leaving on the train on the 4th of February. If you don't sign, war will break out. And basically, they called his bluff and said, Lord Curzon, the Conservative Party in Britain doesn't want you as leader. The British Empire is not what you think it is. We are the free men who will decide when peace breaks out. And Lord Curzon, with all of his following, and it's a very considerable following, left. Well, there were a couple of politicians and diplomats left behind who did what diplomats do, and they played with language. They said, this is not a breakdown. This is a pause. This is a moment of reflection. This is a time for us to work on the compromises behind the scenes and maybe in front of the scenes and bring this peace, which everyone wants, to a successful conclusion. And so they basically showed that Lord Curzon was an emperor who no longer had the clothes he thought he did. He was a powerful man. The Royal Navy was still the most powerful navy in the world, but nonetheless, he couldn't say when peace happened because it required the signature of the victors in the field who were Turkish. What occurred was exactly what the leader of the Turkish delegation, Mustafa İsmet, who was a general, he wasn't a diplomat, and he knew very well how to say no. The best way of saying no, and as a man of 77 years myself, I'm very happy to report to you that one of the weapons that Mustafa İsmet used against the bluster of this brilliant rhetorician, Lord George Nathaniel Curzon, could talk anyone into believing what he had to say. But what is it that he could do when he faced Mustafa İsmet, who was half his size, who was deaf? One of the greatest ways of responding to the bullies of this world is not to hear them. And his military generated deafness from artillery was one of his greatest diplomatic assets. So he was right. Mustafa İsmet was right. He went back on the 4th of February to Anatolia, bringing with him a ring that he bought to present to his boss, Mustafa Kemal, later called Ataturk, the father of his own country, and presented to him on the occasion of his wedding. Went back 6 weeks later and found that indeed it was a pause. Indeed, Curzon couldn't pull any magic. He couldn't go to war. He couldn't go to peace. The only people who could make peace happen were the Turks. And as a result of that, they made, I think, the Treaty of Lausanne into a disaster. This is my view. My view is that the price of peace, which was signed, in other words, which was paid on the 30th and 31st of January in Lausanne, was what is called the Compulsory Population Exchange Agreement. Now, that was an idea that didn't come out of nowhere. It's an idea that imperialists used long before the war and used long after. Curzon was interested in exchanging populations in Bengal, for instance. There is a symmetry to the story only in law. There's no symmetry here. What happened in this peace treaty, and I believe it's the only one, I'd very much like to hear from anyone who can point me to other instances of diplomatic treaties which have a population exchange agreement. Not that wars don't produce enormous flows of population. Get out of the firing lines and try to find some safety, as is happening in Ukraine. But if the peace between Putin and Zelensky becomes an exchange of civilians, that will be the analogy to 1923. I believe it won't happen. I believe it can't happen. But it could in 1923. And the reason was that the Turks had the military upper hand. The person who suggested it did so reluctantly. There have been many books about this wonderful figure, a man called Fridtjof Nansen, who was a athlete, sportsman, polar explorer, an adventurer, a scientist, and a diplomat who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922 as the League of Nations High Commissioner for refugees, first for Russian refugees and then for all of them. And his suggestion, which was read to the delegates on the 1st of December in Lausanne, was that there would be a civilian exchange of Greek Orthodox people from Anatolia and from Muslims who live in Greece. And what that meant was that citizenship is defined by religion. Those who were Muslims in Greece, in fact, one of them was Mustafa Kemal himself, the leader of the rebel side in Turkey. His early days were spent in Saloniki, which only became Greek in 1913. In many ways, what happened in 1923, and which I believe was a disaster, was the recognition that wars end when you exchange prisoners of war. But now, for the first time, wars end when you exchange civilians who are forced to leave. That is to say, when they left Anatolia, the Greek Orthodox people who had lived in Anatolia for 1,000 years immediately lost their citizenship. They were stateless. And when they got to Greece, they became immediately Greek citizens. The same thing happened to Muslims. The day that they set foot on a boat to leave Greece, they no longer were Greek because they were Muslims. And as a result of that, a fundamental part of the peace treaty, signed on the 31st of January, just 4 days before Mustafa Kemal called Lord Curzon's bluff, was the fundamental pillar on which peace was built. And when you build peace on ethnic cleansing, you create a precedent for the 20th century that we all know went elsewhere. The precedent was visible. We are only 6 months before the beer hall putsch in Munich. The notion of Europe being a dark continent that the American historian Mark Mazauer has developed, I think, has no darker chapter than the signing of the peace treaty of Lausanne in 1923. There's another, perhaps 2 points that I'd like to make about what the civilianization of war means. The first point is that the civilianization of war shows that the concept of self-determination has nothing to do with democracy. The Turkish government wanted self-determination, but that was to determine Turkey for the Turkish Muslim people, not for all of the people living in an area, but those of the religion that became the basis of a dictatorship. And it's a dictatorship that, for in one way or another, with some democratic features, has lasted until today. The second thing that I think is important to recognize is that what the Treaty of Lausanne showed is that the end of the First World War could be renegotiated, that it wasn't the end of war. It was just a pause, as Mustafa İsmet corrected Lord Curzon, who thought that it was a disaster to leave and the whole of the world would blow up immediately, or at least he pretended to believe that. And why did this matter? It mattered because there was another imperial power waiting to flex its muscles, who was part of the peace settlement and signed it, and that was the fascist, newly installed fascist government of Benito Mussolini, who had been a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser on the left, in fact expelled from Switzerland in his early days, and came back as the leader of one of the great victorious countries. Well, a month after the treaty was signed, he drew consequences, conclusions from it. And one of them happened after a bit of terrorism. It's still not clear, by the way, I think, who did this, but a couple of Italian soldiers who were trying to mark out the border between Greece and Albania were shot up, maybe by Albanian criminals, maybe by others. And it was a crime that Mussolini decided was certainly done by the Greeks. And as a result, he invaded the island of Corfu. Well, what happened to the peacemaking world of the Allies? Nothing. What they did basically was to give Benito Mussolini what he wanted and to humiliate the Greek government, which had no army to respond. So what we can see in 1923 and in 1924 is the birth of appeasement. Appeasement as the dominant response to dictatorship is, in my opinion, a way of nailing the last nail in the coffin of self-determination as a pathway to democracy. The Wilsonian idea that self-determination was the philosophy of the peace made sense only if the self doing the determining is democratic. Wilson never believed that dictatorship should have the right of self-determination. He believed that it was a way of a democratic life because he made the American mistake of thinking that the way the United States was born could be the way that other countries was born. It's always a danger to project your own national history onto the rest of the world, something American governments have been doing ever since the War of Independence, and Wilson did it too. So my conclusion, I think, is a straightforward one. The Treaty of Lausanne was a catastrophe. It was a necessary catastrophe because no other group wanted to challenge, and no other group had an army able to challenge. Britain, France, Italy, they weren't going to fight against the victorious Turkish forces in Anatolia. The rest of the world was engaged in other things. The French had invaded part of Germany. Financial disorder of Germany had made the banking world extremely vulnerable. And indeed, 5 years later, they found out what that vulnerability actually looked like. So there's something very important about what happened in 1923. And the final word I want to say about the disaster, self-determination out the window, ethnic cleansing as a principle of international law. Those who have the will and the muscle and the money to arm their people are likely to renegotiate the Versailles settlement. The final thing that happened is that the hopes of the Armenian people for a homeland in Anatolia were buried, and were buried completely. In the 800 pages of the proceedings, there is discussion of the Armenian genocide. I don't use the word genocide, but that's what they're talking about. But in the treaty, there's not a word. The word Armenia doesn't appear. It is buried. And for those reasons, those 4 reasons, it strikes me that the Treaty of Lausanne was a terrible precedent for later crimes leading up to the war against civilians that Vladimir Putin is waging today. And one reason why he has to be defeated, whatever the cost, is to civilianize war, is to endanger everybody, is to wage war as he is on hospitals, on schools, on elderly people, on newborn babies freezing because of the absence of electricity. The war that Putin is waging is the war, the civilianization of war that was legitimated by the Treaty of 1923. It is a terrible example of how a peace arrangement can prepare the ground for worse violence to come. I don't want to make a direct link between it and the Holocaust, even though the Holocaust is another example of genocide as war against civilians. There's too many other things that happened in the middle, including the world economic crisis and overthrow of the Weimar Republic and so on. We historians, I think, deal with what I would call threshold events, events that contribute to previous developments, push them along in a certain way, and are in turn the beginning of other developments. I think that's probably the way to put it, that the Treaty of Lausanne was a disaster. It created a series of precedents that were picked up and used by other people in the Middle East in particular. The idea of population exchange, unfortunately, is alive in Israeli politics today. Whatever happens to the conflict there, this is a subject of the civilianization of war, which refuses to go away. And as a result of that, I think a sense of outrage at what Putin is doing in Ukraine, my book, as all books do, has taken on a different coloration than the one that I gave it when I wrote it. I feel a bit about this book the way I feel about my grown-up children. I wish them well, but I don't have that much to say over what happens to them. The book, I hope, contributes to historians' ongoing interrogation of what is war and what is peace, to the interrogation of what Foucault called biopolitics, the notion that human beings are simply cards in a card game that can be dealt out and exchanged over diplomatic niceties. And indeed, it shows something, I think, about the meaninglessness of the victory of 1914-18 in creating a world fit for democracy. Certainly the American story looks to me as if it's in tatters. There are other parts of this tale that I tried to tell in the book, and they are told against the backdrop of some of the most interesting individuals that I think have operated on the international stage. Perhaps what we could do now that I've set out the argument of the book is to have a look at a couple of these images to show you what I'm talking about. and what the book, who are the characters of the book that I've already referred to. Could we have some of the slides and just take them one at a time, please? Yes, this is it. The day the Great War ended. I like that image of a globe that is, shall we say, hollow, colorful, but without a center. There's a number of poems about how the world, the center didn't hold in the years after the war. Well, the center of the peace treaty didn't hold. Next, please. There are two of the major figures. There's George Nathaniel Curzon, Viceroy of India, facing Mustafa İsmet, the general turned diplomat who called his bluff. The next, please. Here is Mustafa İsmet on the right, and his boss, Mustafa Kemal, who given the name Ataturk after the great victory, and who was a clever man who realized that the best way for heads of state to operate is not to go to the peace conference, and if it fails, therefore, to blame the persons there rather than to have it fall on his head. But Ataturk was a brilliant man who was able to construct out of defeat a victory that has lasted to this day. Next, please. This is a very interesting figure on the right. His name is Poincaré, Raymond Poincaré. He's the prime minister and foreign minister of France. And the French desperately wanted peace for the same reason as I said earlier, namely, they had lost their shirts, or at least the middle class had lost its shirts, or the rentier class had lost its shirts. In the Bolshevik Revolution, there was an awful lot of money to be made in the new Republic of Turkey. And there he's explaining to his diplomats how they can help the French middle class get back on its feet. Next, please. This is one I particularly like. By the way, these are contemporary drawings from people who were at the Lausanne conference. There were two Hungarian caricaturists who sold especially to Middle Eastern clients the caricatures of the individuals who were there. The man on the left is called Baron Garroni, and he is obsequious to his boss. The boss is Benito Mussolini, just in power, and the relationship between the two of them is shall we say, utterly clear. The next, please. Here's Fridtjof Nansen feeding the penguins by the second of these wonderful caricature artists, Emery Kellen. And his magnanimity, as it were, to all of God's creatures is one reason why he had a very high celebrity status. I really don't know if there has been anyone in the field of diplomacy in the second half of the 20th century. Maybe Dag Hammarskjöld did. Maybe he was one of those who had this standing. Eleanor Roosevelt, possibly. I'm not sure, but Nansen was a man whose ideas were, I think, a little bit authoritarian. He did go along with the ethnic cleansing. I'm not sure he felt that it was savory, but he felt that it was useful, maybe even a worse way of constructing it. Next, please. Here they are, signing on the 30th of January. Venizelos is on the right. You see a man with a white beard and a formal cap on his head. It's almost like a military cap. That is the prime minister of Greece, who had the good fortune of being defeated in an election in 1921, so that his enemies were the ones who were responsible for the defeat of the Greek army. And the man holding his goatee, as it were, on the left, the second from the left, is Mustafa İsmet. They are signing the population agreement on which the whole peace treaty rested, and on which the pause of the 4th of February was constructed. I think we have maybe one more, but that's, if I could have the next. Here are Greek Orthodox refugees at Mudanya leaving. Now, these are people who had no right to stay in their homes. There are villages in Cappadocia where there were individuals who didn't even know that there had been a war, who nonetheless had to leave their homes in 1923 because they were Greek Orthodox. These are people, these are the civilians whose faces we must understand are embedded in the history of the 1923 peace treaty. Next, please. Here are two more Greek Orthodox priests, a woman. These are the people who are the civilians suffering the civilianization of war. And I think we should understand by seeing the next slide, the last slide, that we should look at these and not turn away. These are refugees from war in Syria. Don't forget what Putin is doing in Ukraine. He had already done in Syria, I think, for 10 years. It shouldn't have come as a surprise to anybody. But on the right, the refugees from Syria, I think they number between 5 and 6 million outside of Ukraine now. And there are another 2.5 million who are displaced within Ukraine. These people are living the phenomenon that I believe was in part born in 1923. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Winter, for this wonderful presentation and highlighting the significance of the Lausanne Treaty with modern times and how the war in Ukraine, like many 20th century wars and invasions, is a reality that how the civilization of war acts and it continues. You have opened a table for discussion and a lot to talk about, I can understand. And I would like to remind the viewers that you can participate, and we hope that you participate in our discussion. Viewers are requested to drop their questions in the chat box, and we would definitely pick them during our discussion. But before that, let me come to our panelists. I once again take the privilege to welcome them. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to introduce our first commentator, Professor Laura Robson. And Professor Robson is the Oliver McCourtney Professor of History at Penn State University. She is a scholar of international and Middle Eastern history with a special interest in questions of refugeedom, forced migration, and statelessness. She has published extensively on ethnic cleansing, refugee, and minority rights, and her most recent book is The Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East. And she writes on ethnic cleansing and refugees, which is her interest. And thank you so much for joining us, Professor Robson. We would like to know your views and commentary. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to participate here. I'm really thrilled to have a chance to be part of this conversation and response to Jay's wonderful book, which I think is a really, kind of a landmark in thinking about Lausanne as one of the fundamental outcomes of the First World War. And one of the ways in which one of the venues for setting up what we have now, for setting up the conditions of the contemporary world. So I'll try to keep my comments brief so that we have plenty of time for discussion. I wanted to highlight just a couple of things that come out of both what Jay has just said and the book itself. And I'm going to kind of divide my comments into two parts. I think that the most important interventions of the book can be divided into two separate spheres, related but separate spheres. One is the kind of slightly more abstract question of what Lausanne brought to the trajectory of modern war and peace. And the other is what it means for the specifics of the post-war political landscape, right? So the kind of specific geopolitics of this post-war period. So in terms of war and peace, I'm very struck by the application of this term civilianization of war to the population exchange itself, not just to the treaty in general, but to the specific phenomenon of mandatory population transfer. And this is actually kind of a shift in the historiography, and it's a really crucial intervention, I think, because it places this mandatory exchange in a broader realm of the making of war and peace, rather than where it has kind of been situated in so much of the historiography, which is in the making of states, right? In the making of nation states, the creation of this, political landscape of nation states that will replace empires in the aftermath of the war. And I want to comment that I think this reformulating is this kind of reformulation, this refocusing is explanatory for what I've always thought was one of the biggest questions surrounding Lausanne and the exchange, which is why, if the exchange was broadly viewed, at least in the immediate aftermath, as a success, which it was celebrated by internationalists, it was, received adulation as a kind of, exemplar of what internationalism could accomplish. Why, if it was viewed as a success, why there were so few subsequent public attempts anyway to reproduce it, and why there was so much anxiety about discussing the quote unquote solution of population exchange, even when it does begin to come up later in the 1920s and 1930s, as it does, for instance, in Palestine, but that's actually not the only example, right? That there are other spaces where this concept comes up, and there's tremendous nervousness about it, right? There's a tremendous anxiety about it, even though we simultaneously have this narrative that it worked, that it was a success, that it created peace, right? That it created the kind of conditions of stability on which a post-war, political order could rest. So if we think about this exchange as a civilianization of war, but still a war, right? It becomes understandable that there's so much reluctance surrounding its use as a tactic, even though the particularities of this particular exchange are mostly celebrated by internationalists in the subsequent years. So I think this is a new lens that really does bring an answer to a question I think that we have long had about Lausanne and its aftermath. Turning to the question of the kind of effects of Lausanne on the political landscape of the post-war order, the book comes to the conclusion that Lausanne is a kind of uneasy peace, and one that is arrived at the cost of the human rights of those who were exchanged, which is an assessment with which I entirely agree. And it also suggests that it represents the interests of the victors in the second stage of the war, right? That we have the kind of the defeated in the first stage of the war who become the victors in the second stage of the war and see that victory reflected in the political terms of the settlement. So I'm also struck by this idea that maybe we need to think about Lausanne as a kind of reversal of the outcomes of the first stage of the war, at least in some spheres. And I think that's an important corrective for the historiography that hasn't really moved away, broadly speaking, from the view that the Allies are the victorious parties in a fairly substantive, demonstrable kind of sense. But I want to raise the question of what happens to the rest of the Ottoman sphere. And in particular, I think perhaps we need to give a little bit of air to all of the things that Lausanne doesn't say. And Jay has discussed both here and in the book the ways in which the treaty is silent on the question of Armenia. But it is also silent on lots of other questions, lots of other nationalities, right? It is silent, in particular, I'm thinking here about the old Ottoman Arab provinces that become the colonial possessions of the Allied imperial powers, about Syria, about Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, which are all being brutally occupied in this very same moment by the Allies, who are, yes, allowing Turkey to get its way, right? Yes, they are allowing the consequences of the genocide to stand. They are allowing the principle of ethnic cleansing as a building block for nation statehood to stand, as Turkey wishes. But they are also getting what they want in the form of territory in the Arab Eastern Mediterranean, and they are getting it in thoroughly illiberal fashion, right? So I think that if we are going to suggest, as you do in the book, and I think correctly, that Lausanne is one of the beginnings of the undermining of the liberal state, we also need to think about the ways in which it left European military control over the Arab provinces completely intact, right? So it leaves an important part. It is not a wholesale reversal of the effects, right? It is a partial reversal in very restricted terms. It is picking nationalities to support in this respect and leaving others to be abandoned. And indeed, we also perhaps need to consider the ways in which that consequence is supported by the League, which includes the supporting of a settler colonial movement into Palestine, which of course is going to lead to its own style of ethnic cleansing a few decades later. And I want to pick up here on the comment that you made about self-determination not equaling democracy, because this is yet another example of the ways in which the concept of self-determination here is picked up by the colonial powers as a kind of rationalization, as a legitimization of what is a new form, but an equally brutal form of colonial military occupation intended to last over the long run. So finally, I want to just pick up on something that I was very struck with in the book, and that is the idea that we should abandon the term interwar period. And I think this is something that really bears further discussion. That you talk about the ways in which the term interwar period suggests a period of peace, or at least a sort of lack of open warfare. Between, even if we adjust the dates as would be appropriate, between say 1924 and 38 maybe. I think this is a compelling idea. I like this idea, not least because, as referring to what I've just said about the mandates, that certainly the interwar violence of the mandates could be conceived of as a state of warfare. It's a colonial occupation, it's a brutal one, and it goes through this entire period. And I would really like to hear a bit more about how we might conceptualize this moment in alternative terms, right? What would we say instead of interwar period? How would we describe this sort of decade plus between the two official wars that is characterized by so much violence, so much brutality, so much political chaos, that is set up in many ways by the Treaty of Lausanne, right? Is it maybe fair to say, picking up on some of your themes, is it fair to say that in changing and in mutating the meanings of war and peace, Lausanne creates a kind of new amalgam of the two? What might we call that, right? I think this is in some ways a question of terminology. I think this is a particularly kind of compelling idea that might point us towards a fairly radically different understanding of this first half of the 20th century. And I would love to hear your thoughts about how we might refer to it, how we might conceptualize it. What are some of the ways in which, what are some of the possibilities for replacing this term interwar period, which has been so widely and broadly used for such a long time? So I'll close there. This is a tremendously important corrective and extension of the historiography on the Great War. And I'm sure that we are all going to be discussing it for many years to come. So thank you.
Professor Winter, would you like to answer the questions?
Well, I think very briefly, I'm very much looking forward to the other two speakers' remarks. I like to talk about a characterization of 1918 to 1938 as the failed peace. A failed peace implies that it didn't work, and I think we can all agree that that's true. But it took time for the web of power relationships to fall apart. It took time, and I don't think you could have seen what I see, which is that Armenia is buried the same way Czechoslovakia was in 1938, but no one in 1923 could have seen that. That was inconceivable, since Czechoslovakia was really a democracy and really did have its own future ahead of it, ruined for a whole series of reasons we know by appeasement. But I really think that the thing that matters most is not to allow students to believe that peace is the absence of war, something that Robert Gervart has written a lot about. So the failed peace is, in many ways, a way of including your points about the imperialism of the interwar years, because that was part of it. There was no doubt about it, that the arrangements of 1918 did not produce the democracy that by the way, that I do think that in 1919 there was a chance. There was a chance that there was as it were, a dialogue between Democrats and authoritarians. But there was a dialogue finally of the deaf, and in my view, the deafness is in Lausanne. So a failed peace. That's what I'm going to nominate for the book.
Exactly. And thank you so much, Professor Robson, for your thoughtful remarks and questions that you put before us. Now I would like to go to our second panelist, Professor David Rodogno. Professor Rodogno is Professor of International History and Politics and the Head of Interdisciplinary Programs at Geneva Graduate Institute. His research interests include history and politics of international organizations and NGOs, history of conflicts and conflict resolution and transnational movements. His notable publications include Fascism's European Empire and Night on Earth. I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Rodogno for his commentary. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much, Jay, for this wonderful presentation. I enjoy the book very, very much, as you know very well. And I also think, just like Laura, that this is a very important book for all of us. And I'm pretty sure it will have a very long-lasting impact on the ways we study this period or this failed peace period, as you defined it. I will make a few comments. The comments are based on your presentation, which I will closely follow. And the first point that I would like to insist on is something that you said at the very beginning, losing control of the mastery of violence. And in this spirit, which is the continuation and rather than the rupture between the two world wars, we should not forget that those who learned the lesson and recovered the mastery of violence were precisely the fascists, and followed by the Nazis. I think they understood the consequences of what it meant to lose the control of the mastery of violence, and they operated from the very beginning, from the outset, trying to regain this control. So I think that the point that you're making here, which refers to the context of the Near East, has broader important political implications, and the case of Corfu shows precisely that Benito Mussolini is an extremely sharp observer of what is happening there, taking notes that then is going to have consequences on the Italians, first of all, and on other people in Africa, in the Middle East, in Libya, we should not forget that, and in the Balkans. But this is an important point that you make. The second point is also related to violence. And I believe, and I know because we discussed this point a number of times, and your reference to Hannah Arendt is not accidental, and I know that you know her work extremely well. And the way you connect the precedents of colonial violence to the brutalization of war in the context of Europe and then of the Near East is particularly relevant. You said something which resonates with me a lot. The rules of engagement change. What I also would like to add here is that there is this suspension of international law, le droit des gens, le droit européen, which was not applied in the colonies, because these were uncivilized populations. Now, the entire process of suspending international law applies to the Near East, to the Greeks, which might or might not be Europeans, but they become part of the same suspension of law, which I think is an interesting point that we might wish to reflect on. The third point that I would like to make has to do with the defeated power, the defeated powers rising up. This is what happened to the Turks. The Ottomans were supposed to be, the defeated ones, but in fact they rise up they reorganize themselves around the nationalists and around Mustafa Kemal, and they end up winning, which means that we historians should do our homework a little bit better when we think about victory and defeat. What's the very meaning of defeat? And the case of nationalist Turks and their rising up means something to me, and something that we might discuss. The fourth point has to do with Lausanne itself. And this is also something that you said that is very often forgotten by historians. You said it when you talked about the negotiators, the Turkish negotiators, and their understanding and the performance of sovereignty that they showed. If there is something that we tend to forget, is the extent to which these diplomats and military, Turkish now, Ottomans before, actually they are both Ottomans and Turkish, and that's the point that I wish to make, had learned so much about the Europeans. They were so sophisticated and so their knowledge of precisely what had been the European power games played so much on their own skins, in their own territories for so long, that then when they come to Lausanne, they play this game way better than their European counterparts. And this is because this very long legacy of Ottoman defeats, of Ottoman diplomatic negotiations in which they were systematically on the defeated side. It's something that it's, to some extent, in my view, plays a very important role. And the Turks don't send anybody in Lausanne. Of course, as you explained, Mustafa Kemal didn't go, but those who go know very well what they were doing. And once again, the Europeans don't pay too much attention to their counterparts because of their imperial arrogance. And Curzon is the victim of his own bluff, as you very well explained. On the exchange of population, I would like to remind maybe the students who are listening to us that de facto, to a very large extent, the population exchange has already happened. It's a fait accompli. There is no way back because so many of these people have already left Asia Minor, left Western Turkey, left the Black Sea region, and they are already in Greece. That the returning to the status quo ante is very difficult indeed. It is also very difficult indeed because of the lack of imagination of people like Nansen. He might have been a great explorer, but his finesse in terms of political thinking, in my view, I'm sorry to say, is not really there. He's utterly incapable to think about an alternative, because like so many others, and this is one of the reasons to respond to Laura, why I think Lausanne is deemed to be a success when in fact is a tragedy, is that so many people think that the nation state and nationalism, the purpose of nationalism is precisely to build homogeneous nation states. And this is the perfect occasion to build on a myth, which, as you correctly say, is religion, a nation state, or two nation states in this particular case. So the place, and this will be my almost last point, this period is these policymakers, the diplomats, the humanitarians that are deployed in this region are all nationalists. And they believe in a future of nation states. And Greece has to become a nation state, allegedly homogeneous. This is, I think, an important part of the story, which explains ethnic cleansing in the end, and an international law based on ethnic cleansing. This is also, once more, how colonial violence and colonial histories from the Philippines to Congo, from Asia to Latin America to Africa and elsewhere, or the Central America, we can think about Cuba or Haiti. This is definitely something that I believe we should stress out. A very last point that I would like to make is something that Laura said, and I do care a lot about, which is the absence of human rights. And some historians believe that this is the beginning of the human rights era. And I'm not persuaded by that at all. In terms of terminology, what happens to the Armenians is defined in the early 1920s as a crime against Christianity. And then this terminology becomes a crimes against humanity. But there is no mention ever in the sources that I read about human rights. And this, I believe, is an important point. I will stop here saying that I took so many notes in your 35 minutes and I enjoyed your presentation greatly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Davide. May I make just 2 points? One is Hannah Arendt's analysis is that the racial definition of politics is the failure of the nation state. That's her fundamental argument, that nation states grant citizenship to those within a border, whatever their religion or whatever their religious practices, which of course is different. Many of the people who fled had nothing to do with the Greek Orthodox Church or Muslims who were non-practicing. What matters was the label built or burnt onto their foreheads. So I do think that the concept of the nation state, as perhaps Tocqueville or Wilson, let's call it the Republican nation state, fails. It fails when ethnicity or religion becomes the only thing that matters, and that I believe is something that turns nationalists away from democracy. That's the point I'm making. That I do think Wilson was vastly, mistaken in assuming that self-determination was the pathway to democracy. But the reason was because nation states were fallible to falling into particularism, namely the definition of individuals by their religion. Now, the only other point I'd make, Davide, that I think we agree on is that the concept of the failed peace gives some force to believe part of Carl Schmitt's notion of the state of exception. And this to me is something that I think we need to meet Laura's point as well, namely that every colonial state is a state of exception, every single one. It never can do otherwise because violence is embedded in the social contract. Indeed, you could say the social contract is that there's a state of exception that will last forever, that will never be suspended itself. So there's something about the failed peace, which is a permanent state of exception, that not only the Nazis learned about, but so did Stalin. And I think one of the intriguing features of the story that I wish I had spent more time on is the birth of the Soviet Union, is 1922. It's right there. It's right then and there at the same time. And with a lot of the fear in the part of in the mind of Curzon, which he believes he avoided, is any kind of unity between Mustafa Kemal and Lenin. That was the nightmare. Well, I don't think the nightmare was going to happen for a whole series of other reasons, but there is a nightmare there, which is that the state of exception is still working in Turkey, and it's still working in Russia. The war in Ukraine is a state of exception. It's a suspension of law. It's a suspension of every other kind of definition of war as a rule-bound institution in order not to let the violence escape from the control of those who started off. So I think the notion of nationalism, in my view, has two parts. One is whether there is such a thing as a nation state that can be democratic, and I think the answer is yes. But when the nation state ceases to be democratic, it looks like Lausanne. That was the point I wanted. Well, I'll stop there too to make sure that we hear the third comment.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Rodogno, for your comments and explanation. So yeah, we would like to discuss more on this, but we have another panelist with us. Let me introduce him, Professor Robert Jarworth. Professor Jarworth is a professor of modern history and the director of Center of War Studies at University College Dublin. As a scholar of history, his research interests focus on European history with emphasis on German history. His scholarly works have been published widely in international journals, and he is the series editor of the OUP's monograph series, The Greater War. His publications are The Bismarck Myth and Hitler's Hangman, The Life of Heydrich. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor, for waiting so patiently. And I would like to go to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. No, I've been waiting patiently because I've been enjoying the discussions so far very much. But also, first of all, I wanted to say congratulations to Jay on this fantastic book. I don't think we've actually seen the cover in our session today. I think it's a very important contribution to the literature on the subject matter. And it is, I think, in fact, the first and only treaty of Lausanne in the English language. And I think that in itself is rather surprising, given how much we've been talking for many, many years about the Paris peace treaties. And we have, this might surprise you if I say this as a Germanist, I think perhaps wrongly over-focused on the Treaty of Versailles, when in fact one could argue that the Treaty of Lausanne is the most consequential of them all, because I always felt, this is already kind of pointing in the direction of one of the questions, that the impact of the Versailles Treaty on the rise of the Nazis has actually been exaggerated, because up until 1929, the Nazis were only a minuscule party on the political margins of German political life. But that's something else we can discuss elsewhere. Obviously, being the third commentator after two super smart contributors like Laura and Davide leaves me in the disadvantage of some of the grounds that I wanted to cover already being covered. Nonetheless, I'd like to make a couple of points, one already in relation to what Laura was saying about the important ways in which the book helps us to critically think about chronologies and concepts of time for what is often referred to as the interwar period. I mean, personally, I don't like the term interwar either, but I do think that there is a post-war period, and that post-war period begins depending on where you find yourself in Europe or the wider world, because chronology is always very dependent on your particular point of view. But for metropolitan Europe, I would say that Jay is absolutely right about saying that in 1923, metropolitan Europe, at least broadly defined, experiences a moment of peace, which doesn't last very long. I would actually say that with the onset of the Great Depression and its effects, the ground is basically created for the rise of totalitarian regimes of different guises, as is the case in early 1930s Europe, not just in Germany, but in large parts of East Central Europe as well. The questions that I would have for Jay are admittedly very large and have already been sort of touched upon very briefly. I agree with you that we have not as yet found a convincing argument why it is the 20th century where, during the two total wars of that century, the number of civilians killed is larger than the number of combatants killed. And I think your book goes a long way in explaining that. But what I was wondering about is, how do we distinguish the civilianization of warfare in the 20th century from, say, the killings of civilians in the 30 Years' War, or indeed in the colonial world? And here, going back to what Davide said, I think it's quite important to bear in mind that the second half of the 19th century in particular is a period when people in the West established rules for warfare in the West. and that these rules were violated already from 1912 onwards in the context of the Balkan Wars, but also then in the context of the Great War. So I think the old question that people like George Mosse, for example, have raised about what is it that brutalizes mindsets, but also practices, is a very important one. And I find your explanations very convincing. I'm just wondering to what extent we should also look at, for example, something that you will be very familiar with, of course, Jay, the whole kind of French decolonization debate about the origins of particular practices of violence lying outside of Europe, or whether we could say that, well, in some ways, Europe, as Mark Mazower said, the dark continent doesn't actually need any lessons from outside Europe in terms of doing horrible things, people doing horrible things to each other. So those are, I think, is a larger point that I wanted to raise. And finally, I would just like to remind the people in the audience that this is an extremely timely book, of course, because we are currently once again seeing the rise of post-imperial revisionist projects when we're looking at Ukraine. What I'm sometimes missing in the current media commentaries on Ukraine is that people very narrowly focus just on Ukraine, perhaps for good reasons. But I always like to say that if we only look at Ukraine, we see too little, because if we're looking at the general context, after all, Putin's post-imperial or pre-imperial project began in Georgia, and we're looking at other areas around the Black Sea, from the Caucasus to neo-imperial Turkey, all the way through, Serbia, and to rearming Finland. These are all spaces that have been pretty restless since the First World War. And it is precisely in those spaces that many of the conflicts of what I would now call the long 20th century, because I think the idea of a short 20th century has been buried in a year ago with the Russian attack on Ukraine. That also in that respect, we need to kind of reconceptual timeframes. And if we're looking at specific forms of violence, that is precisely those spaces of really ranging from the Baltic states all the way into the Caucasus that we need to pay more attention to and explain them precisely from the period that is covered in your excellent book, Jay. So I'll leave it with that, and I look forward to the more general discussion that is about to begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I just raise two points that I think may be useful. The first is, I haven't heard, although it may be there, anyone address the fact that there was a second nation destroyed in Lausanne, which was Kurdistan. Now, the Kurds are players in the ongoing civil war. I think we can call it a civil war. Laura knows more about this than I do. It's a national war. It's a religious war. It has many different facets, but the promise to consider the Kurdish people as candidates for self-determination has been buried and was buried at Lausanne. Now there is, I think, pretty well documented association between Kurdish interests and groups and Israeli supporters. So there's an additional dimension of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so on, that make your point right, that we have to look at this problem of the peace that passeth all understanding being the burial of some nations' wish to have their own state. And Kurdistan, I think, is one of those stories where those in power wanted to push it as far away as they could, and clearly Mustafa Kemal took military action to make sure that there wouldn't be more than significant trouble. But the Turkish state itself is responsible for the ongoing failure to recognize the national aspirations of the Kurdish people. There's a story that no one seems to refer to. Now, the only other distinction that I would like to make between what happened in the First World War and its aftermath and what happened in the 30 Years' War is a little like the war in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine has always a shadow of the possibility of nuclear error or intent, nuclear warfare happening by accident or intent. Now, I think what happens in the First World War is that the Second Industrial Revolution presented the imperial powers with the capacity of creating destructive firepower greater than the world had ever seen before. That's why artillery was the great killer in the First World War, and why there was what the Ukrainians are showing today, that the defensive is in the ascendancy if it can have enough artillery to prevent the, what shall we call it, the infantry charges of the Wagner group or the Russian army from moving across space. So what I think changes everything in the First World War for me is the Second Industrial Revolution and industrialized assembly line killing. That didn't happen in Turkey. It was hand-to-hand killing. It was, it was the face-to-face slaughter that also took place during the Holocaust and so on. But nonetheless, the terms of conflict were industrialized. And I believe the terms of conflict today are nuclearized. Nuclear arms cannot be ignored. They're there, and they are terrifying to everyone who thinks about them. So the capacity to destroy human lives and property, and indeed landscapes, I think is the distinction between the 30 Years' War and the First World War. The 30 Years' War did its share to tell us what destruction could look like. But the industrialization of destruction, I do think, is a fundamental distinction that I'd like to say is true for the war as a whole. I don't think it's true for the Armenian genocide, that was artisanal genocide, face-to-face with, by the way, Kurdish allies of the Turkish killers producing a substantial number of the casualties. But it was part of a global war in which, the most professional army in the world, I think, the German army, was there in Turkey helping the Turkish army benefit from their expertise. And London von Sanders was able to do things in defensive warfare, Gallipoli being a good example of that, that showed the interconnection between the industrialized West and the less industrialized East. So my claim is that the war of 1914-18 and the afterwar, or after wars of 1918 to 23, are part of the industrialization of warfare that produces the capacity, the killing power that made it such a radical change in the way in which human beings organize what we call the institutions of war. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, professors. Now we would like to come for some questions and follow-ups. So our first question is from one of our participants, Yash Singh, and his question is to Professor Winter, and the question is, with respect to the swelling of the territories under the Soviet Union, did the prospect of the Turkish state as one of the buffers between Western Europe and Soviet Union act as a more potent variable than the victory over Greek forces in negotiating a favorable treaty for the Turks?
Yes, that's a very good question. It seems to me that the Bolshevik contribution to Turkish victory was first money and arms. We shouldn't underestimate that. That was significant. But the regime that Mustafa Kemal created was still conservative, in the sense that the Sultan and Caliph were in power during the period up to the Lausanne Treaty. The Sultan is sent away for a luxurious retreat, but the ending of the Caliphate is later. And Mustafa Kemal is very sensitive to the fact that he's got to bring along with him a Muslim population that is deeply committed to Islam. So he waits. And one of the reasons why I think he presents a possible revolutionary alliance with Bolshevik Russia is because it scares the living daylights out of the British and the French. That's for sure. But at the same time, he's doing something else that I think is quite interesting. It is indeed true that among the celebrants of the Treaty of Versailles were Muslim populations in India, who saw the Muslim victory of 1923 as a foretaste of things to come. There's something about the Muslim world bringing the Christian world, let's put it this way, to a more sober sense of the clock ticking on their hegemony. Now, the clock ticked for a long time, and some people believe it's still ticking in indirect fashion. But I think the interesting point is the way in which Mustafa Kemal made it. He threatened an alliance, which I don't think he could politically, for internal reasons, have done anything about. And the only similarity between Stalin's Russia and Turkey's under Mustafa Kemal is that they're one-party states in which the leader is perfectly prepared to kill his enemies without a second thought. One-party states with one leader who represent the revolution. These are caudillos in the Latin American version. It's not necessarily only here. They are among the visionaries, as it were, of this period. And there is something in that question, though, that I think is important. And here I think Davide Rodogno's work is where I've always started. There were rules that were set out in the 19th century, but they wound up meaning virtually nothing. And what's more important is that despite the fact that there was a very substantial food program in Russia, in Turkey, and in many other parts of the Middle East, it added up to very little in terms of providing an alternative to dictatorship. Now, this is a good example, isn't it? The notion that countries that are poor are countries that can go communist. This is by the way, one of the ideas of Nansen. Nansen thought there was a danger that hungry populations actually will join forces with communists. But I think there is a problem that we mustn't underestimate. Laura knows more about this than I do, which is 1918 was a period of famine, not just hunger, but starvation. And this is the backdrop of the failure on the part of the Allies to ram through a peace treaty until it was too late. The Treaty of Sèvres was signed in July, I think it was July or August 1920, the summer of 1920. It's too late. Had there been a treaty available the way in which Versailles was available within 6 months, the whole story would have been different, but they simply waited too long. And that moment of hunger and famine, which was really a terrifying moment for those who lived through it, I think has been lost sight of. It's something we know about hunger in Central Europe. We know about Katie Kollwitz and saving the children in Vienna. But Beirut, Damascus, Jerusalem, these are cities with nothing to eat in 1918. And I think those issues about the nature of the peace. What kind of a failed peace? A peace that is marked by famine is no peace at all. Can never be. And as I said, I've learned from Laura's work and from Davide's work that those who felt virtuous in the aftermath of the First World War because they were humanitarian and they did good, I don't deny the fact that they saved lives, but their efforts were failures, just as Lausanne was. I think I'll stop there.
So, Professor, you have mentioned about Nansen. I have read your previous works about René Cassin and also Raphael Lemkin. We have seen how they fought for they were advocates for human rights. But when it comes to the Fridtjof Nansen, like he was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but after reading your book, I'm in a quite doubt, like about his role. So how should history remember him according to you, like as a peacemaker or someone who had some other motives rather than peace? So yes.
Well, I actually think that both Laura and Davide are in much better position. Laura, would you like to add a word about Nansen?
Sorry. I mean, I think Nansen is one of those figures who has been lionized for reasons that have very little to do with his actual vision. I think, you know, that he embodied the concept. I mean, Davide can speak to this as well, you know, that, but I think he embodied the concept of imperial humanitarianism in so very many ways through his own biography, through his practices, through his actions. And really, I mean, it's always struck me that one of the remarkable things about Nansen is that he is in some ways the only figure whom anyone recognizes from this period, right? That there are so many people working, you know, working in humanitarianism, working in the refugee office. There are others, right? There are other people that we could acknowledge, but he's the one who has received this kind of, you know, lionized status, this recognition, who received the, you know, Nobel Peace Prize, and so forth. And I think it's because he himself as a figure comes to kind of stand for the ways in which empire can remake itself as humanitarian action. And so, you know, it's a very problematic legacy. I mean, I think Davide has written about this as well. And it sets the stage for the concept that humanitarianism can replace politics in some respects, right? And can excuse politics, can kind of lie on top of, you know, imperial policies of resource extraction and, you know, the causing of famines, as you're suggesting. I mean, the famine is a perfect example of the ways in which the Allies sort of, you know, make it happen and then engage in humanitarian activity to alleviate it, right? So I think he's a figure whom we really, you know, have not yet quite come to terms with, and that we need to understand him as kind of a representative of a public relations program on the part of the empires.
Davide, do you agree?
Yeah, I totally agree with Laura. I don't have much to add. He was also extremely, in a way, relieved that the mandates would start where humanitarians had stopped. Now, he doesn't say that so many of these humanitarians stopped because they ran out of money. So, but in fact, he's absolutely persuaded that colonial empires, the British and the French, will do what the Ottomans have failed to do, which is, in inverted commas, to civilize these uncivilized populations. So Nansen is the perfect representative, is the perfect stereotype, or the archetype, if you prefer, of this imperial humanitarian or imperial policymaker, in any case, international civil servant, and that all this happens within the walls of the League of Nations in Geneva. It's also very meaningful because this is really the place where all these ideas interpenetrate, and where these bridges between Western humanitarians, whether they are Americans or Europeans, it doesn't really matter here, and then the League of Nations work, and then the work mandated, delegated to imperial powers and colonial rulers is executed. So there is a convergence of mind. And of course, to go back to nation states and empire and Nansen himself, the only one entitled to have a nation state and an empire are the very civilized, not the others.
Yes. Well, if I could add just one point to that, there is a eugenic tradition of social engineering which I think was particularly strong in Scandinavia. It wasn't only strong in Scandinavia, it was everywhere, so far as I can tell, developed world. But the notion that I find breathtaking is that you don't bring food to people, you bring people to food, is exactly what I mean by social engineering. You literally lift up humanity and provide them with a place where they can plant crops. That is what the Greek Orthodox refugees in Greece were supposed to do, rather than to find ways in which people who are living where they want to live can actually live the lives they do. So there's something radically authoritarian in his outlook, which has a biological component, which we have to recognize has existed on the left as well as on the right. Eugenics was not only a matter of the fascist movement. There were people on the left who believed in it strongly, and many of them were in Britain and indeed saw it as part of the civilizing mission. Interestingly, eugenics was less strong in France because of the strength of Catholicism, which wouldn't have anything to do with it. So the mission civilisatrice had the French Revolution to sell, whereas I think the British mission civilisatrice had Lord Curzon and George V and others to sell. Maybe that is indeed why the Netflix series The Crown did so well, because it's shall we say, a last flourish of la mission civilisatrice, where everyone is perfectly tailored. There's not a spot on the collar of Prince Charles or whatever. These visions of what a gentleman is very much part of the idea of what empire is. There's no doubt about it. And Nansen was extraordinarily handsome. He was, some of my British students in the past would call him spiffy. He really knew how to dress. And he was an impressive man. But his ideas, I think, once again, describe the post-war period, if that word can still be resurrected, as one where democracy is gone and different kinds of social engineering takes place. That, I think, is one way in which fascism can be understood, as well as communism. The extension of social engineering to every facet of life. Well, Lausanne, and I have asked, and I really mean it in this broadcast, and I've asked in many different settings. Lausanne is the first and maybe the only peace treaty where ethnic cleansing is part of a peace treaty, where peace is not defined by the exchange of prisoners that it always has been. Think of Achilles going to, or rather Priam going to Achilles to ask for the body of his son. All of those human exchanges of those who fight and those who are prisoners, of those who die, those are, as it were, normal. What happens in Lausanne is an exchange of civilians. That's what makes the peace happen. I feel it with that legacy, the notion that it is a great success ought to be buried for good.
Exactly. And we are almost at the end of our session. And I would like to take one more question. And this is by one of our participant, Panos. So this question is to Professor Winter, but I'm sure Professor Robert can also answer this because he is a specialist of World War. So yeah, the question is, can you analyze why many experts believe that the Versailles Treaty and the victors opened the road for the Nazis?
Robert, can you refute that?
Yes.
I think we could.
You want me to elaborate on the impact of the Versailles Treaty on Hitler? Is that right? The rise of Hitler?
Yes, the question is that, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so obviously Hitler from the early 1920s onwards stylized himself as the most determined opponent of the Versailles settlement. Famously in his autobiographical book, Mein Kampf, partly autobiographical, partly programmatic, he wrote that the moment of Germany's defeat was the moment of his political awakening. and that henceforth he would have seen himself as a sort of a nationalist revolutionary fighting for Germany to regain its lost greatness, which in the eyes of German nationalists was primarily a result of an internal betrayal, the infamous stab in the back legend, the idea that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefields, but rather had been betrayed, particularly by Jews, by left-wing sympathizers and politicians within Germany, rather than the German army having been defeated by the British and the French in the First World War. Obviously, that was untrue, and Germany was defeated militarily for a number of reasons. But nonetheless, this was a very powerful narrative in the 1920s, and Hitler promoted it very strongly. But as I said before, I wouldn't overestimate the direct impact of the Treaty of Versailles, which, by the way, is actually one of the most lenient treaties of, if you look at the Paris peace treaties in the round, and I would include in that actually, so if we look at all the peace treaties that were concluded at the end of the First World War, I think we need to also look at Brest-Litovsk, the treaty that Germany forced upon Russia, very draconic, and also the treaties of Trianon with Hungary, in which Hungary did lose a substantial amount of its historic territory, and 40% of the ethnically Hungarian population was forced to live outside of Hungary, which is a recurrent issue in Hungarian politics still to the present day. The trauma of Trianon is as much a life issue as is the trauma of the Treaty of Sevres among Turkish nationalists. So the Treaty of Versailles, as I said, was already more lenient, primarily because Britain had no interest in letting France become the dominant power on the European continent. They were not interested in sort of France taking over. But for Hitler, it had some symbolic importance, but it is worth bearing in mind that all German political parties rejected the terms of the treaty, even though they felt compelled for military reasons to sign it. So even the Social Democrats were critical of it. What I think mattered more after 1929, after the onset of the Great Depression, which hit Germany very hard, was, on the one hand, mass unemployment in Germany, very serious economic deprivation, and also at the same time the rise of the communists, so that one of Hitler's other promises, that he would be the only politician determined enough to deal with communism, the threat of communism in Germany, that was ultimately more important. Many people, many middle-class people in Germany were concerned about the rise of communism, and that in combination with kind of material suffering in the early 1930s, I think helps to explain more about the rise of the Nazis. Nonetheless, I think it is still worth bearing in mind that the Nazis never won an overall majority in the German national elections. So even though it was the strongest political party, it still had to rely initially on the coalition with conservative and nationalist partners. So while it obviously matters, I wouldn't exaggerate the importance of the Versailles Treaty on the rise of the Nazis.
One parallel, Robert, that maybe we can use to sum up is the theme of humiliation. I think there is something important about the fact that the Greek nation was humiliated, not just defeated in the field of battle, so humiliated that there was a military coup that lined up and shot the leaders of the king's regime that had brought about this national humiliation, this national disaster. And fortunately, the Allies had a nominee not to come to the table with the responsibility for the disaster on his hands, but he had been voted out of power. It was Venizelos. And he was treated relatively well, but he wasn't in the position of the defeated Greek army. He was their enemy. He was the enemy of the people who brought this about. I do think the concept of humiliation is one that we need to, again, address with reference to Ukraine today as well. It is a theme about the difficulty of peacemaking. Let's talk about the post-war period of 1991, the post-Cold War period. The notion that there was a peace settlement there, I think, can be sustained, and it was also a failed peace. The war in Yugoslavia was part of it. The war in Ukraine is part of it. And one reason may be because of the humiliation of Russian Federation in multiple fashions. I don't want to push it too far, but I do think that I was quite struck. I don't know if you've seen it, Robert. But I just watched the new version that Netflix has done of All Quiet on the Western Front, and they put in it the humiliation of the German delegation by Foch, which was nowhere near Erich Maria Remarque's novel or the film of 1930. It's put in today to say that there were decent German people who were humiliated by the French in the moment of victory, because Foch looks like an utter brute and
yeah, that's absolutely right. Yes, Erzberger, of course, is sort of the friendly enemy.
Yes, that's right. Well, but what I think viewers are supposed to take from that is that the Germans were humiliated. They weren't just defeated; they were humiliated. And I think there's something about a piece of humiliation which is part and parcel of the Versailles settlement, whether we like it or not, because the German delegation has no seat at the table, and they take it or leave it, one way or the other. No negotiation. There were negotiations, of course, but the formation or formulation of the peace treaty of 1815 was rejected in 1919. So there I would see that the Versailles Treaty did give the enemies of the peace treaty a card to play, which they played over and over again, which is that the nation was humiliated. It wasn't just given bad terms, but it was treated the way in which Clemenceau did it. You know better than I that the moment that the German delegation is let into the Hall of Mirrors on the 28th of June, 1919, Clemenceau put at the other side of the door 5 men with disfigured faces, Gurkase, to tell the world, this is why we're humiliating the German people, because of the suffering they inflicted on the whole world. That humiliation of facing men who have no noses, no jaws, no eyes, that I don't think there's a parallel that I know in diplomatic history anywhere of the theater of humiliation being pushed to that extent. And it must be part of the story. And I agree with you entirely. I don't think Versailles led to the Nazis. But I do think it made the peace fail. It was part of the failure that I talked about as the groping towards a solution to the question that Laura posed. Well, how do we do better than talking about les entre-deux-guerres? Clearly won't do. So la lutte continue. We're still engaged in that effort, and I think after 2 hours of conversation, it is becoming to me to thank the organizer for the effort and time to put into this meeting. Thank you very much, Sumal.
Yeah, definitely, sir. And I would have a recommendation to you, Professor Winter, that someday you should write a book on world wars and its impact in the global scale, like how it has impacted in the third world. And you should, I think, take up this project. What do you say? And I think our panelists would also agree to this.
Life is short, but I will be happy to do so together with others. You know, there's some problems that are so big, like the one you just saw. The best way to do them is en famille, together. That I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I would like to thank all the panelists for joining us. It was a great session, and we look forward to collaborating with everyone in future again. And we wish Professor Winter all the best for his new book. And thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.